When it comes to matters of spaceflight and space science, there are few things that piss me off more than NASA's search for life in the solar system, or lack thereof. Believe it or not, there have been no probes sent to Mars designed to look for life since the Viking probe sent down when I was in 3rd grade. Over 40 years with no probe designed to detect life. Opportunity, Spirit, Curiosity, none of them have had equipment specifically designed to find life, although they have found telltale signs of the existence of life. None of them were capable of discovering or detecting any kind of bacterial life or otherwise. And this whole thing has me completely confused because the very first probe that we sent to Mars, at least the successful probe, that is of course Viking, did detect life, did have a positive experiment, and yet we have failed to follow up on that. Why? Even Perseverance, which has a mission that's definitely associated with finding life, is designed only to detect past life, not current life, and although it may unintentionally find existing life, the whole idea, the whole philosophy behind this mission is based around the idea that there is no life on Mars, that there could not be life on Mars, in spite of the fact that current organisms on our own planet could survive on Mars. So really, even Perseverance has no chance of finding life definitively, at least according to NASA's guidelines. And what are these guidelines? Well, a list of them were recently released. And this, in my opinion, indicates why NASA has not been very intent on trying to discover life on Mars. Because according to these guidelines, it is simply impossible to find life off of Earth utilizing probes. The only way to discover life would be to send human explorers there in person. And even then, there would certainly be debate if anything was found. Given the absurd harshness of these guidelines, the Europa Clipper mission will not find life. The mission by Rocket Lab to Venus will not find life. Nothing is going to find life until we actually go there in person. Or is this actually the case? Well, believe it or not, there is actually one mission that lives up to every single one of these requirements, checks off every box on these guidelines, and yet still has not been acknowledged. And I'm going to cover all of this with you in just a moment. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well, so it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry. Okay, so here's the 7-level framework that NASA has given us just in case ordinary people like you and me get too excited about any biosignatures that we may find. The first level is the detection of a signal known to result from a biological activity. This is not a signal from an extraterrestrial civilization, but rather something that is produced by something alive, methane, for example. Level 2, contamination contamination is ruled out. Now, this is a very difficult one because it is so tough to say with 100% certainty that all microorganisms have been removed from a given probe before it makes its journey to another planet. In spite of all the efforts that we make, some bacteria are so hardy and so difficult to detect that it could be impossible to actually 100% rule out contamination. But let's move on. Level 3 is the demonstration or prediction of biological production of signal in the environment of detection. In other words, if you are expecting to find life in a certain environment as a result of a certain experiment, and that experiment comes out positive, then level 3 has been satisfied, and level 3 has been satisfied. In the label release experiment that I've talked about many times on this channel on the Viking probe, certain nutrients were injected into the Martian regolith with the expected result of byproducts, gaseous byproducts being produced if there was anything alive in the regolith consuming these nutrients. And that is indeed what happened. So level 3 has been satisfied. And we move on to level 4. By the way, this is Dr. Patricia Stratt, or rather the late Dr. Patricia Stratt, who was behind these experiments along with her colleague, Dr. Levin, who also tragically died recently, both of them not being recognized for their discoveries. Okay, level 4. All known non-biological sources of signal shown to be implausible in that environment. So if there's anything non-biological that theoretically could have caused the results, then the game's over. And this experiment has fulfilled that requirement as well. Many efforts have been made over the last 4 decades to reproduce the results of the label release experiment using non-biological sources, and all have failed. We move on to level 5, additional independent signal from biology detected. We've got this one covered as well because both Viking 1 and Viking 2 produced exactly the same results on different parts of the planet. Now, level 6, future observations that rule out alternative hypotheses proposed after original announcement. Well, any observations that have been made by the probes that have followed Viking have actually confirmed the results of the label result experiment, and absolutely nothing has been discovered to discredit it. For example, organic molecules. Viking failed to detect any organic molecules during its mission. However, the instruments that it had to do so were not really designed for that purpose and were not sensitive at all compared to the instruments on the probes that followed. As a result, the Curiosity detected organic molecules on a number of occasions, further confirming the hypothesis rather than discrediting it. On top of that, Curiosity also detected, as I said before, quantities of methane that vary widely depending on the Martian seasons. Now, methane produced by volcanic activity would not be seasonal. However, methane produced by seasonal bacteria that tend to die off during the Martian winter and then flourish during the Martian summer would be completely consistent with the existence of life. So we have future observations that confirm the original experiment. And then finally we have level 7, independent follow-up observations of predicted biological behavior in the environment. And this is the toughest one of all because Dr. Levin tried time and again to get more advanced versions of his experiment on probe after probe, and NASA turned him down one time after another. He never got another chance. However, the Russians gave him a chance in spite of the fact that the State Department refused to allow Dr. Levin to collaborate with Roscosmos. Dr. Levin, however, not being an easily discouraged individual, put his experiment on the Russian probe anyway. However, this probe crashed tragically, so these follow-up observations could not be made. However, level 7 technically has still been satisfied, and let me explain why. It has something to do, strangely enough, with level 2. Level 2, as you may recall, has to do with the contamination issue. Now, back in 1977, very extensive efforts were made to ensure that no bacteria of any kind were on the Viking probes. But let's say that some sort of bacteria managed to find its way on the probe somehow and contaminated the experiment on both landers. That seems very unlikely, but let's say that this happened. As we all know, Mars is loaded with perchlorates, a substance that is incredibly hostile to most kinds of bacteria. So not only would these bacteria have to have escaped NASA's efforts to exterminate them, but also they would have to be a particular kind of bacteria that thrives in perchlorates, and those are very rare indeed. So let me tell you what I'm getting at. The types of bacteria that can flourish in perchlorates can also produce oxygen. They actually eat perchlorates and produce oxygen as a byproduct, which means that if any bacteria survive on the surface of Mars or somewhere in the regolith, it would have to be a type of bacteria that was resistant to perchlorates, and for it to flourish, it would actually be better if it consumed perchlorates and produced oxygen. Therefore, we would expect to find a higher level of oxygen in the Martian atmosphere than we anticipated. And this has also been discovered. In 2020, the Trace Gas Orbiter from the ESA detected a green aura around Mars, indicating the presence of oxygen. And this was confirmed by the Curiosity rover in greater quantities than anyone thought would be there. And not only that, this oxygen, like the methane, varies widely depending on the seasons, which means something is producing oxygen in greater quantities during the summer and in lesser quantities during the winter. I wonder what that could be. Perhaps bacteria that are consuming perchlorates when they tend to be more numerous during the summer periods? Well, this by itself would not be proof, but if you add up everything else, the positive results on the label release experiment on both landers, the further confirmation of organic molecules, all of this other evidence piling up, and every one of the 7 requirements that NASA has set forward being fulfilled, why are Nobel Prizes, or rather posthumous Nobel Prizes, not being issued to Dr. Strat and Dr. Levin? And by the way, this isn't the only evidence that the Viking lander produced. The samples were also heated to 160 degrees Celsius, which would be sufficient to kill any bacteria in the regolith, and that's exactly what it did. There was no metabolism after the samples were heated. To confirm that these experiments would not produce false positives, the researchers then tested it on soils known to be sterile, such as samples from the moon and near the Surtsey volcanic island near Iceland, and these produced negative results. As a matter of fact, this experiment never produced a false positive. Never, even in the 40 years that have elapsed since then. So why, again, has nothing been done? Why has there been no declaration that life at least probably exists on Mars? Well, exobiologists are simply clinging to the idea that life cannot exist in an environment being bombarded by radiation and cosmic rays. But while this might be the case for the development of life, we need to remember that Mars once did have a magnetic field, a thicker atmosphere, and liquid water on the surface. And it's not like the magnetic field went away overnight or the atmosphere evaporated instantly. This was all a very gradual process. And as the surface became more hostile, it's logical that any life would evolve to survive under those circumstances. Granted, most would go extinct, but not everything. It's estimated that the ancient Martian Ocean was about as deep as the Mediterranean, and that it was there for at least 1.5 billion years, more than long enough for at least simple life to develop. So really, there's nothing standing in the way of life having developed on Mars and then having evolved to endure the current conditions. Because, as I said before, there are bacteria on our planet, and indeed even multicellular organisms that could survive on Mars without any difficulty whatsoever. So really, again, what is the damn problem? Well, it's because there's more than 7 qualifying factors. The eighth and probably the most important factor is don't get publicly embarrassed and lose your funding factor. If you're going to make a claim as bold as there's life on another planet, you can't risk the possibility of someone somehow debunking this claim, being publicly embarrassed and losing your funding from the government. As strong as the evidence is to support the notion that life does indeed exist on Mars, and not only exists, but is also widespread given the fact that both Viking 1 and Viking 2 produce the same results, well, if that ends up getting debunked, you are in a lot of trouble. So it's safer to just say that the results are inconclusive, and to keep saying that forever. And this is not only a crime against the memories of Dr. Stratz and Dr. Levin, it's also a crime against science, because the Europa Clipper mission, no matter what it finds, will not discover conclusive evidence that there is life off of our planet. Strangely enough, Europa is now being regarded as the most likely place in the solar system to have life, even though we have a lot more tangible evidence of there being life on Mars than on Europa. Nevertheless, I think Europa is an excellent candidate to look for life. The problem is, we never will find life if we have to adhere to all of these absurd requirements. Indeed, even if we send explorers to Mars and they find life in person, if that life bears a great deal of resemblance to life on Earth, which is quite possible if you believe in the concept of transpermia, that is to say, life being transmitted from one planet to another by meteors, asteroids, etc., then the argument can always be made that we put that life there, that one of those crashed Soviet probes or something else was not properly decontaminated, and this life that we've discovered was actually put there by man. And it will be very difficult to argue against that unless this life is very different from our own on an evolutionary basis. I certainly hope that's the case once we finally go there, and once we do go to Mars, and once we do definitively discover life there, as we are certain to do, then a posthumous Nobel Prize must definitely go to Dr. Levin and Dr. Stratz and everybody associated with the Viking lander, which in my opinion discovered life on Mars way back in 1976. If you like what I have to say, if you like my opinions even though they tend to differ from what the majority has to say, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and there's certainly benefits to be had if you become a Patreon supporter, or if not, a like and subscribe would be very much appreciated. So until we have a paradigm shift at NASA, until they become more open-minded about the idea that life is as natural a process in our solar system as gravity and everything else, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.